So my name is Elkins, and as you heard, I do some disturbing research. And I am the director of the Artificial Intelligence Lab, which is a new lab we started in the MIS department. And my research for the last 10 years has looked at two issues, one of deception and one of artificial intelligence. Two topics which have become increasingly more of interest in culture. Why do I look at this research topic? Well, and this may be a surprise to some of you, but most of us are terrible at detecting deception, even experts. We often are overconfident, and we rarely are proven otherwise, so we just assume that we're really good at detecting deception. So time and time again, meta-analyses after meta-analyses always conclude about 54% accuracy. Experts tend to have a lie bias, so they just falsely accuse more often, and we generally assume people are telling the truth, and so we are generally not catching lies, especially the lies we want to believe, and white lies. I'm going to give you a little bit of background to kind of make you a little bit more in the know of how we actually tackle this problem, because it seems like an intractable kind of a problem, but there are a structure that we can apply to it. First we look at deception as a communication act, meaning that there's not in a vacuum. There's a liar and then there's someone who's being lied to. And so that is where interpersonal deception theory comes, which means that there's someone who's sending a message, who's trying to be perceived a certain way, to manage impression. There's somebody who's receiving it, judging the veracity of it, then responding, then that message is then interpreted, and there's sort of a back and forth, meaning that there's a dynamic, and how you might lie in the beginning to your boss, to a loved one, is different than how you might lie in the middle and in the end. Now, the way that we measure this is to look at the behavior, verbal and nonverbal. And you can think of it as being kind of in two categories. One, non-strategic. These are the things we didn't intend to do during the conversation. Things that you typically think of during like a polygraph exam, which would be like heart rate and blood pressure. These are the physiological measures. These are generally related to your anxiety or high stakes. Then we're also looking at emotion. So these are things like sadness or surprise or happiness or anger or contempt. And not just the existence of these emotions, but most often the suppression of them. People who are lying off and trying to hide or mimic an emotion, or they often just stop emoting because they are worried about being perceived as false. And then we also look at memory-based features. These are things related to response orientation, things that you're familiar with, your memory. So we can get at that with eye tracking and the way that you might respond, like a Pavlovian dog responds to a bell. On the other end of the spectrum, we have strategic things. These are the things that we're doing intentionally as an impression management technique. These are the things we do in the interaction to try to make people believe us, so that we might try to sound more believable, overly enthusiastic, or we might try to shorten our message length to not be found out. There's a lot of different ways we measure these things. This is not exhaustive. You see, we can look at the voice, if a smile is real or not, is in the eyes. Does it develop or blossom naturally? We can see the rigidity, the extent to which they get stiff. Oftentimes we find when people overmanage their face or their voice, they lose control of the rest of their limbs. Here's an example of a familiarity study that we've run. We have people build a bomb like this, an IED. You can see that it has all these notable aspects to it, including this trigger mechanism right over here. Then during the course of an interview where we're asking them about whether they recognize this device, this is how a guilty person might look at it. What you see is the eye fixation. And you can see their eyes keep going to the part that's different, that's missing. And so we can capitalize this guilty knowledge, we call it. And we can see that if you are familiar with an object that a guilty person is familiar with, then your eyes keep flirting back and saccading over there. If you're innocent, you often look at it like this. Your eyes are sort of interested in only the stimulation part of the image, the things that's interesting visually, not the barren part of the pipe. When I started this research program at the University of Arizona, this is what my lab looked like. We had sensors strewn about, human interviewers, clipboards, subjects, sensors everywhere, thermal camera, laser Doppler vibrometer for heart rate at a distance, infrared, microphones, very intimidating. The interviewer there, we was on loan from Department of Defense, generally very structured. They do polygraph exams. Still, every time they did an interview, it was completely different. They asked a question in a different order, they went back, they asked follow-up questions, so it became extremely hard to generalize a model or to identify features that were the same across interviews. And some interviewers, they were friendly, some were mean, some were tired, some were experienced, some were inexperienced, so we got a different interview every time, which, the signal-to-noise ratio is very high. So detecting deception is hard as it is without all this variance that was in this. So the way that we solve this issue is we started developing a way to automate it. to replace the actual human interviewer and incorporate what we know about deception theory in this interviewer. Not much to look at. This was our first prototype about 2008. It started to work. People took it seriously as a social actor. This is our second prototype. We got a kiosk floor model there. Not much to look at, but it looked the part. Third generation we actually built from ourselves, and we engineered it with all the sensors integrated it, but it had some major flaws, like not height adjustable, and we could only interview people who are like 5'2" to 5'7". This is the current generation. We're actually working on the follow-up to this one right now for a project that's in place. We built it with NCR, and you can see we have an eye tracker, a microphone, it's height adjustable, a Kinect in there that we don't use so much, high definition camera, we put a force platform on the floor. All the sensors that used to be in that large room, we've integrated. Things have gotten a lot smaller and cheaper since then. And the overarching premise behind this is that there is no kind of Pinocchio's nose. You need to have these multimodal measurements and combined and fused, and then using modern machine learning, we make recommendations to officers who are collaborators with this system that we call the avatar. Now, fast forward a little bit. The real problem that I look at is at border control. So I worked a lot with Homeland Security, with Frontex, which is Homeland Security in Europe, to figure out how we're going to solve this issue of airports, border crossings, where we have an increasingly larger throughput of people. We can't make the airports bigger, we can't make bridges larger, we can't just add people to the problem. And we also have increasingly more sophisticated attacks and attempts that you can't just rely on X-rays and chemical sensors, so you need to actually intervene. And so the question is, how do we make the system more efficient and more safe? And that's what we're trying to do in testing in airports and in border control and border crossings. So then I want to talk you through one quick experiment that we ran recently with the Canadian Border Service Agency. And this was in March of 2016. We went to Ottawa, Canada. We worked with local CBSA, and we had 82 participants who were experienced travelers with an average age of 42, and we recreated essentially their customs interview process. They've got this customs declaration form here, and we randomly assigned half and half to be guilty or innocent people. This was the procedures that we had for each of the participants in this study. We had them issued an ID, so you were given an identity, and in the guilty condition they were given a false identity. Then they were asked to pack a suitcase. And the people who are in the guilty condition, they packed drugs, basically a pack of cocaine. And then they went and they talked to the avatar. This is kind of what the avatar interview looked like. I'll just play a little bit of it. No? Not much to look at. So he's here on the screen here, and he's asking him some of the questions. We'll move right along. So during the course of that interview, which they asked them 17 questions, and so one thing to bear in mind is I'm not proposing that we're working on a general deception detection system. It is extremely adapted to the specific scenario and to the questions that we're asking in the population that we're working in. But given that population in that specific scenario, we can get really good accuracy, and here's how we do it. First, using the camera, we extract emotional expressions using one tool called Interface, which is open source. And then we extract eye tracking information on where they're looking on the screen. And then we also record their voice during the interaction. And then we extract features from their vocal signal. And then we also look at the language of the words that they use and the statements that they made. We took those raw signals and we extracted features. So a question is maybe 5 seconds, 10 seconds response, but we have these raw signals of, an audio is recorded at 44,000 times a second. The eye tracker 60 times a second. So what we do to overcome that is we window them and create these different measurements, or what we call functionals, across each question. So you could say, like, what was the average vocal pitch, the median vocal pitch, the standard deviation of vocal pitch, all these different ways to describe the dynamics of that behavior at that period of time for that question. So we end up with about 6,400 measurements of voice for every question, 36 measurements of pupil, 94 different facial expression, and then the extent to which they fixated on the screen at 28 different times during the interview. To do training and testing, this is kind of a summary of how you would do a machine learning study like this, or artificial intelligence. We took 75% of the data and we used it for building the model, and we put aside another 25% in what we call a test set that we only use to calculate the accuracy and the performance. We then used a whole suite of different kinds of machine learning algorithms. One's a random forest, which is essentially just a way of combining thousands of decision trees into one model. A support vector machine, which is just a way of you doing a really advanced nonlinear regression. And a neural network model, which is all the rage, in terms of deep learning, but a smaller version of that because we didn't have as much data for that. We used tenfold cross-validation to build the final model, and then we calculated accuracy. And here's the final results. For eye fixation, we were able to predict with an accuracy of 75%, using just the faces, 73%, pupil, 73%, just the voice, 68%. And the most surprising part of this, which is really an important part of my research now, is that if we took all the different behaviors and combined them in one model, we actually had the lowest accuracy. So just because you have different measurements in one model, it does not mean that you'll do better overall, even if you won't do as good as even the best performing individual model. So that's really an important thing to think about, because leading up to this, we always assumed, oh, okay, well, obviously it's multimodal. Some people, when they lie, it shows up in their face. Some people, when they lie, it's in their voice. We just throw it all in the pot and we'll build a better model and we'll sort it out. That's not the case. So we're working on trying to suss that out and build a better model that maybe combines them and then votes on the final one, or incorporates time better in a time series manner. So with that said, I'd like to take any questions.
I hope I'm not lying here. Guess the question is, you got a 75% accuracy rate. How does that compare to human interviewers?
It's 25% better, roughly.
25% better.
Not just 25% better than the best humans, but consistently. And so one of the issues we have with human judges is vigilance and their ability to run past 30 to 40 minutes.
So, Aaron, when can we expect to see these in the airports?
Well, if you go to Singapore, you might see them next year. We just got a grant from Singapore government to do some research on this and build a version of it for the Malaysian-Singapore border.
So it seems like the eye fixation is really an important one.
Yep.
Is that literally the position of the eyes, or is it the movement of the eyes that you're measuring? Is it the derivative, or is it the position?
It's a little of both, but it's principally the fixation points. What I didn't show
What's your
here,
resolution? What's your spatial resolution on that? How far apart can you really detect with the computers?
So when we do this analysis, we actually have a specific protocol where we actually put something on screen that includes cutting the screen into 4 corners. And so we have enough resolution to always tell if they're in one corner or another corner. In each of the corners, we have stimulus. And in this particular one, we had guns, weapons, explosives, and drugs. And we were able to find a pattern in the way they avoided the drug images. Yeah, basically the resolution of the screen. And we can usually get about 20 pixels error. Yep.
I was waiting to have the little mic. I can see that first.
Go ahead. You finish the mic,
Okay.
and then we'll bring
Aaron,
it to you.
you've shown a model where the machine is in one place and the human being is in front of it. What about the reverse? Can the machine read off of, say, a Skype with that individual, so you could do this remotely, or does the individual have to be present in front of the machine?
They don't have to be present, but then we would be reducing the modality. We'd only be able to do audio and some basic video, but yeah, it would still work. It'd be pretty different. Yeah.
I'm just curious if it was known that eye movement is what's being tested, can people be trained to avoid being detected by changing their eye movement?
Not only can they be trained, but they try to beat it. And one of the studies that we've run is actually in countermeasures, where we ask them to try to beat it. And so one of the things that's nice about eye movement is it's really hard to fake, and we can detect artificial eye movement easily. So I'd love for any of the bad guys to do that, because we can see it.
To what extent are the indicators that you looked at specific to lying versus any other emotionally intense condition that can trigger eye movements, skin conductance, anything else? I mean, you see where I'm heading, false positives.
Yeah, I would say that not very many in these studies are related to any intense emotional stress, because there's no high stakes. Most of what we saw was related to response orientation and familiarity, and the fact that they had drugs on them and they recognized that. But yeah, I mean, one of the things that we do in the model is base themselves as their own baseline, so that if they come into the interaction a little bit tense, then we can count for that. We don't just accuse people who are nervous.
Is there any evidence that it's ethnic or culturally based, that people from different cultures might have different ways of looking at things physically with their eyes?
Yeah, there is evidence for that.
So-
Western and Eastern cultures particularly
Yeah.
scan images differently.
So how
we
do-
would never apply this model out of Canada or out of the West.
So do you need a specific model for a specific region of the world?
Yes.
And when you have, in an international airport where you have a whole mixture of cultures, how do you have certain people stand at certain machines, other people stand in front of other machines? How do you deal
Well, the
with
same
that?
machine can be used. It just would adapt the model based on their passport information and things.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So you put the passport in, the model changes.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we did when we were in Romania. It speaks a different language. It speaks to them. It just changes.
Hi, hello, Professor. Good evening. This is Parveen Mohammed. I'm actually really novice in this field, so please bear with me if my question doesn't meet the standards of the stalwart sitting over here. So, coming to the math part of the data analysis, I just have a question because I've been working on one of the softwares. Can you just elaborate that cross-validation concept? Like, how did you achieve it to reach the optimization? I mean, say suppose you have 100 samples. 100 data items, and you have set 75 to be the data set and 25 to be the training set, considering random tree to be the model which has to be implemented. Say suppose the cross-fold validation, if you keep on changing it from 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, the gain keeps changing, right? When do you actually obtain that optimization, like this data is sufficiently good which can be implemented to test the audience? I hope my question is really wrong.
I think I follow with you. So you had a little backwards. The 75% was the training set, 25 was the test set. The cross-validation we applied to the training set. And so there's really no great answer to this. We'll generalize, but the way that we do it is we do the 10-fold cross-validation, and then we build the model, and then we use a grid and just search through the different parameters.
Okay.
And then the cross-validation is our best reflection of a test data. And then when we find the best parameter set from that, we then take it over and we just evaluate it on the test set.
Okay, I mean, how does the why is the cross-validation fixed to 10? I mean, is it variable based on the gain? I mean, based on the data available?
Why did we pick 10 folds?
Yeah.
Just to reduce the variance.
Okay,
And
because
when you say gain, and can you elaborate? The gain, do you mean the improvement or do you mean the lowering variance?
exactly.
Yeah, 10 was the best number for our data. It was large enough that we could have 10 folds and it would be equal size.
Okay, I mean, 10 is good for your data, as in the data which you have collected to be used for the training, is it?
One more time?
The data which you have collected to create the whole model. So for that particular data, the cross-validation 10 is giving the optimal gain. Is it?
Yes,
Is it the thing?
that's right.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
One last question.
All right.
Thanks. If you ever had the pleasure of flying to Israel on El Al, you get to experience professional interrogation.
Yeah.
But I had a question. So two people interrogate you, and they often ask different questions, but sometimes they ask the exact same question. And I thought that was because there are two people. But I'm wondering if it's the exact same question, do you answer differently the second time? And is that something important?
Yes. I mean, time matters. That is one of the most important findings, is that if I asked you this one question in the beginning of the interview, and then over the course of the interview as it's developed and we built rapport and we've moved through topics, and I ask you again, your response is different. And not only is it different based on time, it's different based on what we show on the screen. And so oftentimes when I ask people, okay, are you who you say you are? And they say yes, little to no effect in the voice. Then I show them their passport on the screen and ask them again, and it changes their response. So yes, there's a lot of things that factor in how they respond.
I lied about the last question. Sometimes when you're on your international flight and you come in and you're tired and bleary-eyed and not quite yourself, does that influence the response?
It would definitely influence it. I mean, we would have to build a model. I mean, I haven't looked at that specifically, but I wouldn't want to use that specifically on the red-eye flights and things. But yeah.
If we could give all of our speakers a round.